She offered to care for a stranger's grandmother, not knowing his millionaire grandson would fall for her. That was exactly how Emma Parker would describe her own fairy tale a few months later, laughing at the absurd coincidence that changed her life on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. But on that day, as she rushed across the rain-slicked sidewalk in downtown Boston, all she knew was that she was late for a job interview and had just collided with precisely the wrong person. "Oh my God, I am so sorry," she exclaimed, realizing her coffee now decorated the impeccable suit of the man standing before her, a suit that, even to her inexperienced eyes, seemed to cost more than her monthly rent. The man looked at the brown stain spreading across his white shirt, then at her, with an expression that mixed surprise and something Emma couldn't quite decipher. "Do you always attack strangers on the street, or am I a special case?" he asked with an amused tone that didn't match the situation. Emma felt her face heat up. "I really am sorry. I'm late for an interview and—" She began frantically searching through her purse. "I can pay for the dry cleaning, of course. I just—" "Don't worry about it," he interrupted. "I have meetings all day, but now I have an excuse to cancel the most boring one." When his phone rang. Emma watched his expression change completely as he answered, the amusement replaced by concern. In a few seconds, he seemed to have aged 5 years. "Grandma is where?" he asked the person on the other end. "What do you mean, alone? Sarah was supposed to—" "Yes, I'm heading there now." Emma took a step back, ready to continue on her way and leave this stranger to deal with his problems, when he hung up and looked at her as if he'd just had an absurd idea. "What is your name?" he asked abruptly. Emma Parker," she replied, confused. "Emma, you seem like a decent person, despite your terrible balance with coffee cups. I need a favor." She raised her eyebrows. "A favor? Like, give me your kidney-us kind of favor? Because we just met and—" He laughed, a genuine sound that caught her by surprise. "Nothing so permanent. My grandmother is home alone. The caregiver didn't show up, and I just found out she fell trying to reach a book on the shelf. She's okay, but needs someone with her until I can get there, which might take hours because of traffic and meetings I can cancel. And you want me, a complete stranger who just ruined your suit, to go take care of your grandmother?" Emma asked incredulously. "Exactly," he confirmed, with a confidence that left her even more perplexed. You said you were heading to an interview. I can call any company in Boston and get you a better one later. But right now, I need someone for my grandmother, and you just became available." Emma opened her mouth to refuse this absurd proposal, but something in his look stopped her. It wasn't arrogance, as she would have expected from someone who believed they could secure jobs with a phone call. It was genuine vulnerability, hidden behind a facade of control. "How do I know you are not a serial killer using an imaginary grandmother as bait?" she questioned, but she was already taking out her phone to call the company and reschedule her interview. A small smile appeared on his face. "Nathan Anderson," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "And if I were a serial killer, I'd choose someone who did not know the exact location of my stomach with a cup of hot coffee." It was in that moment, as she shook hands with a man she'd just met and agreed to care for his unknown grandmother, that Emma should have realized her life was about to turn upside down. But she was too busy trying to ignore the tingling she felt when their fingers touched, and the strange sensation that, for some inexplicable reason, she trusted him. It wasn't until she was in a taxi heading to one of Boston's most elegant neighborhoods, with Mrs. Eleanor Anderson's address noted on an impressively heavy business card, that Emma finally questioned her own sanity. On the card below Nathan's name were the words CEO Anderson Enterprises. She had just agreed to care for the grandmother of one of Boston's wealthiest men, and she had spilled coffee on him, and she had cancelled her job interview. She'd been preparing for weeks. "What the hell did I just do?" she muttered to herself as the taxi, paid for in advance by Nathan of course, turned toward an address that seemed to belong to another world. What Emma didn't know was that this was just the first of many moments when she would question her decisions regarding Nathan Anderson, and that none of these decisions would compare to the insanity of what would come next. She found Mrs. Anderson to be a sharp-witted, elegant woman in her 80s with a penchant for literature and strong opinions. They spent hours in delightful conversation, with Eleanor sharing stories of her youth as one of the first women to attend Harvard Law School, how she met her late husband, and how she helped build the empire her grandson now commanded. When Nathan finally arrived, looking exhausted but relieved to see his grandmother well, Emma felt strangely out of place. After brief thanks, he asked to speak with her privately. "I want to hire you," Nathan said bluntly once they were alone, "in his elegant study. Excuse me? As my grandmother's caregiver, full-time. But I am not a professional caregiver. I am a nurse. Even better." He crossed his arms. "Look, the previous caregiver quit without notice. My grandmother is, let us say, a challenging patient. She has scared off 5 professionals in the last 3 months. But she seems to get along with you." "We just met," Emma protested, "and you've already established a connection. Besides," and he smiled slightly, "you owe me a new suit." Emma felt her face heat up. "Mr. Anderson—" "Nathan," he corrected. "Nathan, this is crazy. You don't know me. You know nothing about me." He tilted his head. "I know you cancelled an important interview to help a stranger. I know my grandmother, who distrusts everyone, likes you, and I know I need someone reliable, fast." He took a pen and wrote something on a piece of paper. But this would be the salary, plus benefits, of course." Emma's eyes widened at the number. It was almost 3 times what she expected to earn at the job she had interviewed for. "That's too generous," she murmured. "It's the price." "Of peace of mind," he answered simply. "And there's one more condition." She raised an eyebrow, suddenly suspicious. "You'll need to live here, at least during the week. My grandmother needs constant supervision, especially at night." "Live here?" Emma's voice went up an octave. "That's completely inappropriate." Nathan looked genuinely confused. "Why? The house has a completely separate staff wing. You have your own apartment, practically." Because, Emma searched for words. "Because we just met, and this is strange." A slow smile formed on his face. "Are you worried about my reputation or yours, Ms. Parker?" "Both," she exclaimed. "Besides, I have my own apartment, my own life. How about a trial period?" we suggested. 2 weeks. If it doesn't work for either of us, no hard feelings." Emma should have said no. It was the only sensible answer. But then she thought about her overdue rent, the bills piling up, and Eleanor's expression when telling her stories. And there was something else, too, a curiosity about this man who trusted strangers with spilled coffee to care for his grandmother. 2 weeks, she finally agreed. "And I go home on weekends." When Emma left the mansion an hour later, her head spinning and a contractor review in her bag, she couldn't stop thinking about the expression on Nathan's face when he saw her talking with his grandmother. As if she were an equation he couldn't solve. As if she were something completely unexpected in his perfectly organized world. What she didn't know was that Nathan Anderson never trusted coincidences, and that he had already done a complete background check on her before even getting home. After a week at the Anderson mansion, Emma was beginning to get used to the routine. She woke up early, had breakfast with Mrs. Anderson, administered her medications, accompanied her on short walks through the garden, and spent afternoons playing cards or reading to her. The elderly woman's ankle was improving, but Emma noticed How she sometimes seemed short of breath after minor exertions. Nathan briefly appeared in the mornings before leaving for the office and returned late at night. Their interactions were cordial but distant, except for the moments when their gazes met, and Emma felt that strange tension in the air that left her disconcerted. It was on a Wednesday night that the routine broke. Emma was in the library, looking for a book Mrs. Anderson had requested when she sensed a presence behind her. "Insomnia?" Nathan asked, making her nearly drop the stack of books she was holding. "God, you scared me," she complained, placing her hand on her chest. "No. Your grandmother wanted to reread Pride and Prejudice. Apparently, her copy is somewhere in this infinite library." Nathan smiled and approached, taking a worn book from the highest shelf. "This one. It was the first gift I gave her when I was 12. He handed the book to Emma. "I think she'd start testing you." "Testing how?" Emma asked, confused. "This was my mother's favorite book." His voice grew softer. "Grandma only lends it to people she completely trusts." Emma felt the weight of that information. "I didn't know. She likes you." He observed her intently, as if trying to decipher a puzzle. "More than she has liked anyone else who has worked here." "Your grandmother is an extraordinary woman," Emma responded sincerely. Nathan nodded, but suddenly seemed distant. "She is all I have left." There was a silence between them, heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Emma gathered the courage to ask what had been bothering her for days. "Why did you trust me that day? A complete stranger who ruined your suit?" Nathan studied her for a long moment before answering. Intuition, maybe, or desperation. He smiled slightly. "Or maybe because you were the first person in years who treated me like a normal human being and not as CEO Anderson." "Well, I didn't know who you were," she pointed out. "Exactly." His eyes met hers. It was refreshing. Something in the way he said that made Emma's heart race. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. "Your grandmother is waiting for the book. I should—" "Of course." He stepped aside. "I don't want to keep you up." Emma walked to the door but stopped when she heard his voice. Again. "Emma?" There was an unusual hesitation in his tone. "Tomorrow I am taking Grandma for some tests. I'd like you to come with us." "Tests?" Concern was immediate. "Is she okay?" Nathan's expression grew somber. "It's just a routine checkup." But Emma knew that expression too well from her years working in hospitals. It wasn't routine. There was something more. The next morning, while helping Mrs. Anderson get ready for her appointment, Emma noticed how tense the woman seemed. "Is everything all right?" she gently asked, adjusting the silk scarf around Mrs. Anderson's neck. The elderly woman sighed. "Nathan worries too much. A little shortness of breath, and he already thinks I am at death's door. He loves you," Emma said softly. "It is natural for him to worry." "Or he never got over his parents' death," Mrs. Anderson confessed, sadness in her eyes. "So young, and suddenly he had to take over everything. The company, caring for me. It changed him." "How was he before?" Emma could not contain her curiosity. A nostalgic smile appeared on the woman's face. "Oh, he was such a cheerful young man. Played piano, loved sailing, had friends everywhere, laughed all the time." She touched Emma's arm. "Now he only truly smiles when he talks about you." Emma blushed intensely. "Mrs. Anderson, please, it is not like that." "Old people see things young people try to hide, my dear." Mrs. Anderson patted her hand. "Now let us go to this annoying appointment before my grandson comes to rush us." The clinic was as elegant as Emma had imagined, While Mrs. Anderson had her tests, she and Nathan waited in a private room. The silence between them was heavy. "How long has your grandmother been having these respiratory problems?" Emma finally asked. Nathan seemed surprised. "She told you?" "She didn't have to. I'm a nurse, remember." I noticed her shortness of breath after small efforts, like climbing stairs. "We." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she realized was a sign of nervousness. "It started a few months ago. The doctors suspect a heart condition. And you didn't tell me this when you hired me." Emma couldn't hide her frustration. "I thought Grandma should decide how much she wanted to share," he replied defensively. "She hates being treated like she aches sick." The diagnosis was as Emma feared: moderate heart failure, treatable but requiring medication, constant monitoring, and lifestyle changes. On the way back to the house, the silence in the car was oppressive. Mrs. Anderson slept in the back seat, exhausted after the tests. "Why didn't you tell me the whole truth from the beginning?" Emma finally asked, keeping her voice low, not to wake the elderly woman. Nathan kept his eyes on the road. "I thought you wouldn't take the job if you knew the severity of the situation. So you lied to me?" He glanced at her briefly. "I prefer to think I temporarily withheld information. I needed someone reliable, someone with medical training. And you chose a stranger who spilled coffee on you." Emma shook her head, incredulous. "It wasn't quite like that." He hesitated. "After you agreed to come, I did a background check." Emma felt her blood freeze. "You what?" "I needed to be sure it was safe to leave you with my grandmother," he defended. "And I found out you graduated with honors, worked for 3 years at Mercy Hospital until the pediatric ward closed, and have impeccable references." "That's an invasion of privacy," she exclaimed, trying to control the volume of her voice. "It is precaution," he corrected, "and that says why I insisted on hiring you. You were exactly what we needed." When they returned to the mansion, Emma helped Mrs. Anderson settle for a nap, adjusted her medication according to the new prescriptions, and went to her room, needing space to think. But the conversation with Nathan wasn't tea over. Hours later, a soft knock on her door made her get up from the bed where she was rereading the medical instructions. Nathan was standing outside looking exhausted. "Can we talk?" She nodded, following him to the back garden. The night was clear, the sky dotted with stars. "I apologize for not being completely honest from the start," he began. "But I don't to regret bringing you here." Emma crossed her arms. "You could have trusted me. Trust doesn't come easily to me." His voice was laden with something that sounded like regret. "And when my parents died, many people tried to take advantage of the situation. Since then, I've learned to be cautious." "How did they die?" Emma asked softly. Nathan looked at the sky. "Plane crash. They were returning from an anniversary trip. I had just turned 25. He took a deep breath. "Overnight, I had to take over a multi-million-dollar company and care for my grandmother, who, at the time, was devastated by the loss of her only son." Emma felt her irritation dissipate in the face of that confession. I'm sorry." The vulnerability in his voice touched Emma deeply. Without thinking, she touched his arm. "She has a serious but treatable condition, and now she has both of us looking after her." "Both of us?" He looked at her. "So I'll stay?" "Dull." The question hung between them, loaded with meanings beyond the words. Emma knew she should be furious for being manipulated, for all the half-truths. But looking at Nathan now, seeing not the powerful CEO but the man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders since he was too young, she couldn't walk away. "I'll stay," she finally answered. "For Mrs. Anderson." Something passed across his face, relief, gratitude, and perhaps something more that neither of them was ready to name. "Thank you." he said simply. And in that word there was more emotion than any elaborate speech could convey. 2 weeks turned into a month, and soon Emma found herself completely integrated into life at the Anderson mansion. Her routine with Mrs. Anderson had comfortably established itself, and the lady Ishi's health showed signs of stabilizing with the new treatment. What Emma didn't expect was how her own life would begin to intertwine with the family beyond the professional aspect. It all started one Sunday afternoon. Emma had returned from her weekend at home and found the mansion strangely quiet. Mrs. Anderson was napping, and the staff seemed to have the day off. That when she heard the music. Following the sound, she came to a room she had never entered before. The door was ajar, and through the gap she saw Nathan sitting at the piano playing a melancholy and beautiful melody. His fingers glided over the keys with a precision that spoke of years of practice, and there was an expression on his face she had never seen before, a raw, almost painful vulnerability. Not wanting to interrupt such an intimate moment, Emma tried to move away quietly, but the wooden floor betrayed her presence with a sharp creak. Nathan stopped immediately, turning toward the door. "Emma?" "Sorry," she said, blushing. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just heard the music and it is fine." He indicated the space beside him on the piano bench. "Come in." Hesitantly, she accepted the invitation. Up close, she noticed how different he looked in casual clothes, jeans and a simple shirt that made him seem younger, more accessible. "I didn't know you played," she commented. "I don't, not anymore." He passed his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. "Today was my father's birthday. Playing was our tradition." Emma felt her heart tighten. The music was beautiful. Bach. It was his favorite. Nathan looked at her with an intensity that made her stomach leap. "You came back early." "Yes," she confirmed, adjusting herself on the bench. "I was worried about Mrs. Anderson's new medications. Wanted to be here for the first evening dose." Nathan observed her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You really care about her, don't you? It is not just a job for you." "Your grandmother is an extraordinary person," Emma answered honestly. It was impossible not to become attached to her. They played piano together, and for 20 magical minutes the outside world disappeared. There was just Emma, Nathan, and the music they created together, imperfect, hesitant, but somehow beautiful in its simplicity. She laughed when she missed a note, and to her surprise, he laughed too. A rich, genuine sound that completely transformed his face. "You should laugh more," she said without thinking, and immediately felt her face heat up with the impulsive comment. He studied her intently. "I didn't have much to laugh about in recent years." "And now?" she asked, unable to look away. "Now," he began, but was interrupted by the sound of thunder in the distance. "Looks like rain is coming." As if to confirm his words, a flash illuminated the room through the windows, followed by thunder much closer. In a matter of seconds, the rain began to fall hard, beating against the glass panes. Before they could say anything else, a deafening crash shook the house, followed by total darkness. The power had gone out. Nathan went to check the generator, and Emma went to check on Mrs. Anderson. When they met again, it was in the kitchen where Emma was gathering candles and emergency supplies. It was then she heard a noise coming from the back door. Cautiously, she approached. To her surprise, she saw a soaked man trying to enter. For a moment, panic dominated her until she recognized him as Michael, the gardener. "Miss Emma, it is Mr. Nathan." He was checking the generator when a branch fell. "I need help." Emma's heart raced. Without hesitation, she grabbed the first aid kit from the pantry and followed Michael outside, ignoring the rain that immediately soaked her to the bone. They found Nathan near the generator house, sitting on the ground with a pained expression. holding his right arm close to his body. A large branch had fallen near him. "Nathan!" She knelt beside him, her nurse training taking over. "Where does it hurt?" "And damn fine," he tried to dismiss, but his pale face said otherwise. "The branch just grazed me. I think it is just a sprain in my shoulder." "Let me check," she insisted, carefully examining his arm and shoulder. "It doesn't seem broken, but you need ice and immobilization. Can you walk?" With Michael's help, they managed to get Nathan back inside the house. Emma guided him to the kitchen, where she had better access to water and ice. With professional skill, she cleaned a cut on Nathan's forehead that he hadn't even noticed, applied ice to his swollen shoulder, and improvised a sling with one of the kitchen towels. "You need to get out of these wet clothes," she said, trying to maintain a professional tone despite the sudden awareness of how close they were. "So do you," he replied, noticing how she was shivering slightly in her own soaked clothes. Their gazes met, and for a moment, the air between them seemed charged with electricity that rivaled the storm outside. After ensuring that Mrs. Anderson was safe and comfortable and that Nathan had changed and taken painkillers, Emma finally went to her own room to dry off and change. She was exhausted, but her heart was still racing when she thought about how Nathan had looked at her in the kitchen. She was almost falling asleep when she heard a soft knock on her door. Opening it, she found Nathan, his arm still in the improvised sling. "Sorry to bother you," he said, "and I just wanted to thank you for today." "I was just doing my job," she replied, all too aware of the fact that she was wearing only a simple cotton pajama. "No, you weren't IT." His voice was soft, almost vulnerable. "Your job is to take care of my grandmother, not me." Emma didn't know how to respond. It was true, technically, but somehow during the last few weeks, the line between work and something else had become terribly indistinct. "And I would have done the same for anyone," she finally said, even knowing it wasn't entirely true. The panic she had felt upon learning he was injured went beyond professional concern. A small smile appeared on his lips. "Well, anyway, thank you." He turned to leave, but then stopped. "You know, I thought you would leave after discovering my grandmother's condition. Most people would run from extra responsibilities." "I am not most people," she answered simply. "No, you're not." There was something in his look that made her heart race again. "Good night, Emma." The next morning, while helping Mrs. Anderson with her medication, Emma found the elderly woman unusually pensive, observing her with an evaluating look that made her uncomfortable. "Did you and my grandson have a fight?" she asked abruptly. "Of course not," Emma replied, surprised by the direct question. "Why do you think that?" "Because you two are acting like two scared cats around each other," Mrs. Anderson huffed. "And because Nathan has gone back to working late every day, as he did before you arrived." Emma didn't know what to answer. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? "It is complicated," was all she could say. Mrs. Anderson studied her for a long moment. "You know, when I met Nathan's grandfather, he was my boss. I was his secretary, fresh out of college." Emma looked at her, surprised. This was a story the woman had never shared before. "Everyone said it was crazy, that he was using me, or that I was after his money." Mrs. Anderson smiled at the memory. "We spent 6 months dancing around each other before he finally found the courage to ask me to dinner." "And what happened?" Emma asked, genuinely curious. 43 years of marriage happened." The woman's eyes sparkled. Sometimes the heart knows what's right, even when the mind invents 1,000 reasons to say it's wrong. Emma felt a lump in her throat. "Mrs. Anderson, the situation is different. Your grandson made it very clear that—" "My grandson is as stubborn as a mule," the woman interrupted, "and he is scared. He lost so much, so young, he's afraid to open himself up to more losses." Before Emma could respond, they heard a noise from the door. Nathan was standing there, a strange expression on his face. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, but his tone suggested he knew exactly what he was interrupting. That evening, Emma made a difficult decision. As much as she loved working with Mrs. Anderson, as much as she cared for the woman, the situation had become unsustainable. The climate of tension wasn't good for anyone, especially a cardiac patient. With slightly trembling hands, she typed her resignation letter. 2 weeks' notice, enough time to train a replacement. It was the most professional thing to do. The next morning she knocked on Nathan S. office door. He seemed surprised to see her there. "Emma, what can I do for you?" She extended the envelope. "My resignation letter." The surprise on his face quickly gave way to something more complex. Shock, confusion, and perhaps hurt. "May I ask why?" he questioned, without touching the envelope. "I think we both know why," she answered softly. He finally took the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, he continued looking at her as if trying to memorize her face. "Your grandmother is much better," Emma continued. "The treatment is working. She's following all the recommendations. You can hire a traditional nurse now, someone who can keep the relationship strictly professional." The last word came out more bitter than she intended. Nathan put the envelope on the desk, suddenly looking older and tired. "Grandma will miss you." "I'll miss her too," Emma responded honestly. But it is better this way," he nodded slowly. "If that is what you want, it is not about what I want." The words escaped before she could contain them. "It is about what is possible." Their gazes met, and for a moment Emma thought she saw something in his eyes, a flash of emotion that contradicted his rigid posture. But then he looked away. "I understand. I'll respect your decision." The formality in his tone was the final confirmation that she was doing the right thing. Still, as she left the office, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving behind much more than just a job. The night before her departure, Emma was finishing packing her things when she heard a knock on the door. She expected it to be Ricardo, or perhaps Mrs. Anderson coming to say goodbye. She wasn't prepared to find Nathan standing there, looking as if he hadn't slept in days. His hair was disheveled, and there was an intensity in his eyes that caught her off guard. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "I think we've already said everything there was to say," she replied, trying to maintain her composure. "And no, we haven't tea." He entered the room, closing the door behind him. "Why are you really leaving, Emma?" She looked at him incredulous. "You know why." "I want to hear it from you." Something inside Emma broke. All the frustration, the hurt, the contained feelings of the past weeks overflowed. "Because I cannot pretend this is just a job for me anymore," she exclaimed. "Because every time I am near you, every time I see how you care for your grandmother, every moment we spend together." She took a deep breath, trying to control herself. "Because I fell in love with you, Nathan, and you made it very clear that you want only a professional relationship." The confession hung between them, heavy and irrevocable. Emma waited for the polite rejection, for confirmation that she was doing the right thing by leaving. Instead, Nathan took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I lied," he said simply. "What?" "When I said I wanted only a professional relationship, it was a lie." His voice was hoarse with emotion. "I've been lying to myself since the day you spilled coffee on my suit." Emma's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Why?" "Because I am afraid." The vulnerability in his confession left her breathless. I lost my parents overnight, almost lost my grandmother. The idea of opening up to someone, of risking feeling that pain again, so it is easier to feel nothing, she asked softly. That's what, I thought. He took another step toward her. Until you showed up and turned my world upside down. And now, the idea of you leaving. He didn't complete the sentence, but he didn't need to. Emma could see the truth in his eyes, the same truth she had tried to hide from her own. And what do you want, Nathan? She asked, needing to hear the words. You, he answered simply. I want you, Emma. Not as my employee. As everything. The space between them seemed to shrink, the tension they had ignored for so long finally acknowledged. When their lips met, it was as if all the barriers they had built crumbled at once. Epilogue. The Anderson mansion, S. Garden, had never looked so beautiful. Flowers of all colors decorated the space, and small lights were strategically hung to shine when the sun set. In the center, an elegant table for three was set with the family S. best china. Emma adjusted the final details of the decoration, nervously checking her watch. It was Mrs. Anderson's 85th birthday, and everything needed to be perfect. The last 6 months had been an emotional roller coaster of changes. After that night, when she finally admitted her feelings for Nathan, her life had completely transformed. She didn't leave the mansion, but she also didn't continue as an employee. Instead, she became part of the family in a way she had never imagined possible. It looks beautiful, Nathan's voice came from behind her, followed by his arms, wrapping around her waist. Grandma will love it. Emma smiled, leaning back against him. You think I didn't want to overdo it, but I also wanted it to be special. It is perfect, like you. He softly kissed her neck. And I have. A surprise for both of you today. Another one? She laughed, turning to face him. You've already brought the whole family for the main party tomorrow. What else could it be? Nathan's mysterious smile only intensified her curiosity. In the last few months, she had learned that when he smiled that way, something important was coming. The sound of the garden door opening announced Mrs. Anderson's arrival, leaning on her elegant new cane. The woman's health had improved significantly, and although she still needed care, her energy and vigor had returned surprisingly. Later that evening, after dinner, Nathan took a small velvet box from his pocket and knelt beside Emma's chair. Emma Parker, he began, his eyes fixed on hers. You entered my life literally by accident when you spilled coffee on my suit that morning. It was the best accident that ever happened to me. Mrs. Anderson brought her hands to her mouth, her eyes shining with emotion as she watched the scene. You taught me to open my heart again, to not be afraid to feel, to love. Nathan continued. You brought light to this house and to our lives when we needed it most. And now I can imagine a future without you. He opened the small box, revealing an elegant solitaire diamond ring. Would you do me the honor of marrying me? For a moment, Emma couldn't speak, overcome with emotion. All the doubts and insecurities she had ever had about belonging in Nathan's world had dissipated over the months. What they had built together went beyond social or financial differences. It was real, it was deep, it was true. Yes, she finally managed to say, tears flowing freely. Yes, I want to marry you. As Nathan slid the ring onto her finger and kissed her, Emma was absolutely certain that she had found her place in the world. It wasn't the mansion, or the luxury, or even the promise of their future travels together. It was there, between these two people who had become her family. Mrs. Anderson applauded cheerfully, her own tears of happiness running down her wrinkled face. I knew from the beginning, she declared triumphantly. From the moment you said you had spilled coffee on his suit, love stories always begin with little disasters.